All right, so looking at those sheets that you have right there that you just tried to outline, you should see mutations in gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift should be there as well. And then it says a little bit about adaptations on there too. You should have one that has adaptations by natural selection. So these are all agents of evolutionary change. What does that mean?
They all cause evolutionary change.
Yeah, and remember, this whole section, when you guys think about evolution, I want you guys to be thinking about genes. I want you to think about alleles, right? So remember Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which we're going to come back and do some calculations with. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium said, hey, if a population is in equilibrium, that means there is no evolution. If there's no evolution, then all of the alleles in that population are remaining constant. The frequency of alleles, the frequency of genotypes, the frequency of phenotypes in that population, you can think about it from a genetic perspective, it's all remaining constant, right? And for those things to remain constant, then there should not be natural selection happening. There shouldn't be mutations happening to genetic material like you talked about in Bio 1. We know that the population better be large. If it's not large and you're working with a small population, there's going to be some effects due to small random chances, which we talk about with genetic drift. Individuals need to be randomly mating. They don't need to be selecting their mates. And also, they shouldn't be moving from one population to a next, and nothing should be coming to your population. If these things are happening, then evolution will occur, right? That's what it's saying. That these things are mechanisms of evolution. These are things that are going to relate to evolution. And we're going to see in a population that there's change. If a population is not changing, then we should see when we work with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, all of our numbers will remain constant. So the numbers of recessive alleles, the numbers of dominant alleles, everything will remain constant if the population is in equilibrium, meaning that there is zero evolutionary change. So let's talk about each of these and what they mean for evolutionary change as we go through. We just went through these Hardy-Weinberg principles. All right, mutations. When you hear the word mutation, what do you think? Alteration of genetic material. What'd you say, Ivan?
Change in genetic code.
Change in the genetic code. And what does that mean? It means we're changing some A's, T's, C's, and G's, right? We're changing some of those fundamental nucleotides that are associated with the genetic material. That's what the mutation is. How do mutations come about? Remember, there's mutagens, there's chemicals and physical things out there that can cause mutations to the DNA. This is why they talk about not going to the tanning bed and allowing that ultraviolet light to hit you all the time, or don't go outside without sunscreen on and spend a bunch of time in the sun. If that ultraviolet radiation gets to your DNA, it can cause mutations. It can cause the removal of genetic bases and the insertion of other bases in their locations and issues with DNA that can cause your DNA to mutate. If you've ever consumed any product in your life, you know that there's tons of things out there that if you consume enough of it or use it enough, it says this is carcinogenic, right? This could be a mutagen. This could be something that could potentially cause mutations to your DNA. That just means that there's something happening with our A's, T's, C's, and G's. Notice here, a T to an A, or there's some kind of change to the genetic sequence than there was before. Notice it was GT-GC, now it's GA-GC. We're manipulating that genetic code. Normally this doesn't happen. This doesn't happen that often. Mutation rates are pretty low. Remember polymerase that puts together the DNA? It doesn't make a lot of mistakes. In fact, it has proofreading abilities. It can look back and say, oh, I jacked that up, and it will replace it back to its proper state. So we know that mutations, changing the DNA, is not going to happen that often. Remember, DNA changes cause DNA differences. DNA differences lead to different phenotypes potentially down the line, right? And different phenotypes are going to be related to how an individual interacts with its environment, which is what we're talking about here too, in terms of evolutionary change. So is everybody okay with what mutation looks like, what it means? Remember, for evolution to take place, there has to be genetic variation in the population. And since mutations are the original source of genetic variation, if there was no mutation, then we wouldn't have any difference in DNA. Everybody's DNA or every organism's DNA could be exactly the same. But those mutations, if you look down here, we can see that changes in the bacterial DNA can lead to a phenotypic difference, and maybe that will lead to antibiotic resistance or something like that. They could then be a beneficial trait for an organism. Bless you. But I do want you guys to realize while mutations do influence evolutionary change, right? It is one of the mechanisms of evolutionary change. They don't happen that often. And in fact, if they do happen, when mutations happen, they don't usually result in a completely different phenotype that's going to make an individual better in their environment or worse in their environment. Usually it's a pretty small thing. What were you going to say, Ivan?
I was going to ask, doesn't the DNA have, doesn't it have like multiple proteins that can, like, doesn't this A's, T's, and G's sequences code for the same protein? Like, there are like multiple different sequences.
Yes, there can be multiple sequences that code for the exact same protein, right? We talk about that wobble base on the third base pair of the codon, which can mean that multiple different codons can code for the same amino acid, leading to the same type of protein. So even a small mutation in one base doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a phenotypic difference, which is also why even a small mutation at low rates doesn't mean that there's going to be a big phenotypic difference. All right, the next one after mutation that we need to get to is gene flow. Gene flow is exactly what it sounds like it is. When you hear gene, what are you thinking?
DNA.
Portion of the DNA, right? It's the A's, T's, C's, and G's, a section of the DNA. If the DNA is flowing, no, it's not being poured out of a container, right? Where is it flowing? It's flowing from one population to another. By some means, an organism is going from its population, a group of organisms, it's making its way to another population it doesn't normally interact with, and it's contributing its genes. How will that organism contribute to its genes? If it's a sexually reproducing organism, then we know that when it mates with others, there's going to be a combination of sperm and egg through that mating event, right? And that's what we mean by gene flow, is organisms coming from one population to another one, mating with those individuals, and being able to give them certain genes that were not there normally in that population, or maybe vice versa, going the opposite direction. When we say movement of alleles, that's really just related to those specific variations of genes, right? So it's still on a genetic level. So gene flow is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's the movement of genes from one population to another, generally through reproduction. If this bunny makes its way over here, right? I think they have a saying about bunnies. You can bet it's going to transfer genetic material to this population if it has the ability to do so. That means that the genes that are associated with this brown coloration are start to get mixed into this gene pool over here, adding new alleles to this gene pool. Was it a mutation that added new alleles to this gene pool? No. They didn't get mutated to have more brown alleles. They got brown alleles from the brown bunnies that came over there, right? They didn't have brown alleles before, maybe they did, but now they have new alleles coming from a new population. Gene flow. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm gonna let you guys watch this video on your own. It is, it's a good video. It is a McGraw-Hill video. Check it out. It's about gene flow. It goes through the same thing we just talked about, but it is posted in the PowerPoint on D2L. Watch it. All right, non-random mating. So non-random mating, what does that mean? If we mate randomly, what would that look like? If we mated randomly, what would that look like? Okay, well, so let's think about a population. Think about humans for a second. I think we talked a little bit about this before. Do we mate randomly?
No.
No. Tell me something about you. This may be personal, so don't feel free not to say it out loud if you don't want to. But what do you look for in a mate? What's something you look for? And let's be a little shallow here. What do you look for phenotypically in a mate?
Like, appearance-wise?
Yes. Nice teeth. Hair a certain way, certain color.
Tall.
Not probably styled a certain way, but I mean maybe you do. I don't know. Height, good, yeah, right. I've seen that, right. You don't see a lot. I'm just saying. I'm not saying this is to anybody, but I've never really went online, social media, and saw someone saying, well, actually, maybe someone saying like, I'm looking for myself a nice pale short king, right? That's not usually what people say. They usually say like, oh, I want that tall, dark, and handsome, baby. That's what they say, right? So then you got to get those TikTok shoes that add 3 inches to your height. You know they're always trying to sell. Now we can still look at TikTok, right? That is not random, right? If it was random, we wouldn't care about all that stuff. We just walk outside, pick somebody randomly, and mate with them, right? And that person would be fine with it too, because it's random. But non-random mating does change frequencies. You can imagine if people are only mating if they're tall and beautiful, then in the future we're probably going to have a bunch of tall and beautiful people,
Well, that would be
right?
nice.
And the people who are not mating are not going to be contributing their genes to the next generation. So non-random mating, where we're not just randomly picking people, we're selecting for certain traits, is going to influence evolution over time, right? It's going to change the gene pool. It's going to change what types of alleles we have in the population. And it's really weird to think about that from a human perspective, but this is true amongst all of the animal kingdom. We see it all over the place. It's true about certain areas of plants too, when we talk about artificial selection and things like that. Mating is rarely random, right? We don't usually see random mating happen that often. Usually there's a reason why an organism chooses to mate. We just talked a little bit about sexual selection, which is related to choosing a mate for a reason. Maybe you're the just most beautiful frog that's able to puff out their throat to make all the ladies love you, or whatever that might be. Artificial selection. We know that artificial selection is we're specifically mating things on purpose, right? We've done this with dogs. We've artificially selected dogs to get certain breeds. Artificial selection, obviously this is not random. We're not letting the dogs just choose. We're like, oh, we want this really tiny dog that looks real cute. We're gonna mate these dogs together and hope we get the best breed that we want out of it. That's artificial selection. That is not random. Non-random mating does change allele frequencies. It's going to change the way the population is, right? If there was some big dogs and some small dogs in the population, we decided, no, we don't want to have big dogs anymore, so we stopped mating big dogs and we only allow small dogs to mate with each other. Yes, that will change the propensity of big dogs and small dogs in the population and the allele frequencies over time. That will eventually lead to a change in frequencies. Okay, looking at types of non-random mating, we've got something called assortative mating. We've got something called disassortative mating. And this is not necessarily just one thing happening in each population, but in assortative mating, individuals that are similar to each other, phenotypically similar to each other, will mate with each other. You can imagine that, right? I know we come back to the human perspective because we're humans and we're, I don't know, we like ourselves.
A bit narcissistic.
But you think about, you probably know some people too that would only mate with people that are similar to them in some way. We see that in other areas of the animal kingdom as well. Phenotypically similar individuals who mate with each other. This is assortative mating. Of course, it's going to lead to more homozygous individuals in the population, right? Because we're going to see individuals that look similar to each other with the same alleles mating with each other, increasing those same alleles over and over and over again. In disassortative mating, we would see that individuals that are different mate with each other, phenotypically different from each other, mate with each other. In this case, of course, this would lead to more heterozygotes. So that means that maybe we have some homozygous dominant individuals mating with a bunch of homozygous recessive individuals, right? If that's the case, then we'll end up with a bunch more heterozygotes in that population because we got the big alleles and the small alleles mixing now. This is disassortative mating. Okay. We talked a little bit about inbreeding last semester, but we'll see a lot of different effects of inbreeding as we go through. Generally, inbreeding means that we already have these genes within the family, and so we're mating within the family, which means we're not changing allele frequencies within our family because we're just using those allele frequencies that are already there, so it stays pretty consistent. All right, so what have we talked about so far in terms of our mechanisms of evolutionary change, or what could potentially change allele frequencies? Mutations, gene flow, non-random mating, and we're hitting genetic drift here, right? Genetic drift says fluctuations of allele frequencies from generation to generation can be happen because of sampling error. This is the key right here. Circle it, highlight it, underline it. Random events change allele frequency. So Aaron was saying this earlier. When you think of genetic drift, I want you to be thinking of random events. It's going to be because of random events. Can random events lead to a change in allele frequencies in a population? It can. If we look, if we have a combination, in this case we're seeing that some birds have migrated away. The founder effect is a component of genetic drift. It's an example of that. But look over here, we've got some red birds and some yellow birds, right? If a couple of yellow birds end up at at this island over here and there was no birds of their species previously, and now they get there and only red ones made it over there, then is that going to affect the allele frequencies? Yeah, there may not be any yellow alleles in this new population, right? Depending on how that trait was inherited. Now, over here we had some yellow and some red. Over here we have only red. So we have in this new population affected allele frequencies. Affecting allele frequencies is changing. It is changing over time. It is evolution. And it happened because of the founder effect, which is an example of genetic drift. Of course, this would happen especially with small sample sizes and a small number of individuals migrating. If we had a huge flock of these birds and somehow the new population was founded with another huge flock of them of the same sort, then there probably would still be a mix there. We generally see that genetic drift is going to affect small populations. Okay? The bottleneck effect, you guys have seen a bottleneck effect before. What does that mean? What can that be related to? Yeah, you've probably seen it in your textbook. You see it right here. What are these representing? It says original population. What are those colors?
Pink.
Yeah, they're related to phenotypes, which are related to genotypes and alleles, right? Now, if there's a bottleneck event, some kind of bottleneck event, what can a bottleneck event be? Should be random, which means it should not be selecting for certain alleles. What should happen is that for some reason, whether this be a hurricane, a volcano, something that is going to drastically change the landscape of that population, gets rid of a bunch of the alleles and only a few alleles are left over in that surviving population. Generally, we think about this from a natural disaster standpoint. If we have a big population and something comes in and destroys most of the population, only a few individuals are left over to continue that population. Those few individuals may not have the same allele frequencies or the same genotypes as the original population. You guys notice right here, there's blue and white. Up there was some yellow in there too. Did we remove a complete organism or genotype from the population? Yeah, we did, right? How did it happen? It wasn't natural selection. It wasn't gene flow. All it was is a random natural disaster that ended up destroying some of the individuals in that population. And maybe it destroyed all of the individuals that had a certain genotype. That is a bottleneck effect, the bottleneck effect. Okay, it's chance. When we say random chance, that means that the hurricane, the volcano, the natural disaster did not choose which ones it was going to kill. And we know that that's not how that works, right? They come through and it happens the way that it happens. Especially when we talk about it from an animal standpoint, right? They're going to be out there in the population and they're just going to be there and trying to survive. Okay. Founder effect is along the lines of what we looked at with the birds already. Just showing you here polydactyly, looking at some extra fingers that we talked about last semester, carried as a dominant trait. It's carried by a dominant allele. We said that it's not that common in the population generally, right? But it's still carried forward on a dominant allele, which is kind of weird. Remember, just because an allele is dominant or a trait is inherited dominantly doesn't mean that it's going to be found more often in the population, right? It can be still found in lesser numbers. But what we do see, and we know that the founder effect has played a role, we know that in certain communities that have branched off and became their own community and continue to inbreed with each other and stay within the community, that we see greater numbers of certain things that we wouldn't see naturally in a normal population, such as polydactyly. if we have a few individuals from a population that has polydactyly that end up branching off to a new population, and let's say that 3 out of 5 have polydactyly, now that population, as they start to mate with each other, they're going to have a lot more polydactyly in that population than a normal population, right? Because they've taken polydactyly genes and brought them to a new place, and now the individuals in that new place primarily have that gene for polydactyly. Okay, founder effect. It will affect the allele frequencies in a population. We can see that evolution takes place because of this. Remember, these are all called mechanisms of evolution. That means we're seeing a change over time based on multiple different factors. One of them was mutations. What's another one? They're all at the headings of your desk there. We talked about mutations already. What else did we talk about?
Genetic drift, gene flow, and non-random.
All right, let's think about it. Genetic drift. What were the types of genetic drift? Founder effect and the bottleneck effect. What else? Non-random mating. Someone said gene flow already, right?
Oh.
All right. Remember, these are all mechanisms of evolution.
How is the founder effect different from gene flow?
Remember, founder effect, and I think that Aaron, was this your question earlier too? Founder effect and gene flow?
No, mine was about gene flow and genetic drift.
Okay, got it. So founder effect and gene flow. Founder effect is about organisms that end up in a new place and continue to propagate the alleles that they had based on who moved into that new place. Gene flow, we've got a couple of populations. There's new genes coming into a population that already exists, and they're adding new genes to a population. Founder effect is a new population starting in a new place without any other individuals. Now, if some people migrated to a new place and there's enough population already there and they're contributing genes to that population, then that is gene flow. Okay, here's an example. Wasn't a natural disaster, but in terms of the bottleneck effect, looking at the near extinction of the northern elephant seal. As hunters were going out and killing this seal, do you think that they were necessarily looking to see from a distance what they looked like, or were they just killing them as much as they could? Well, they were really just killing them, right? They were just trying to kill as many as they could so that they could obtain the products of them and utilize that for sale. Well, by doing that, there was an original parent population. As they started killing them, they weren't looking at their genetics. They weren't seeing what their alleles looked like. They were like, here's a seal. If I kill it, I'm going to make, $1,000 off of this seal, or whatever it is, in the in early 19th century. So, as they did that, you can imagine that there may be certain alleles that ended up going away because they killed all the seals that had certain alleles and left only some surviving individuals. There were only a small subset of the original population. Because it was random, and because the surviving individuals did not represent the original allele frequencies of the population, this is a great example of a bottleneck event. The bottleneck event was the hunters killing all those seals instead of a hurricane or something like that. All right, y'all okay? Any questions? All right, now let's look at natural selection and selection in general. We know that natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. That's the one that we primarily focused on with Darwin last semester, and it is the one that we primarily focus on in terms of evolution always, because evolution is the only agent that produces adaptive evolutionary changes. If you think about the other ones, mutations, we don't know what we're going to get necessarily and how that's going to be adaptive to the environment, right? Gene flow, genes come in, doesn't mean it's going to adapt to the environment. Those genes may not be good for whatever the environment looks like at that time, right? All of the other ones don't result in adaptive evolution where organisms that are able to survive and reproduce in their population get to do that into future generations, right? Because of their alleles. But selection can allow for that, and so we say that it allows for adaptive evolution. I'll come right to you, Ivan. Okay. So you guys, we've already talked a lot about selection. You guys know that individuals that have certain phenotypes that allow for them to be able to survive and reproduce in their environment are going to be able to survive and reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation. A few generations down the line, when we look, at that population, there will be more alleles of one type than there are of another type based on whether organisms were able to survive or not in their population. We did an example with giraffes before. You've seen the peppered moths example. There's a billion examples of evolution that are out there by means of selection. And so, of course, selection does result in a change in evolution in alleles over time. Okay, artificial selection. Remember, that means that we are choosing specifically to mate organisms together to get certain phenotypic products out of that. You see these cute little pups over here? Look at these, look at all this cute little variation that we see down here. This is not a natural thing, right? This would not have ever come about if humans didn't decide to mate dogs to make these cute little things that are here, right here, right? And so this is artificial selection. Breeding for desired characteristics, okay? Now that's based on the breeder. Some breeders think that certain characteristics are cute or are going to be marketable, and so they would breed these organisms for their marketability and what they thought was cute, what people would want. Of course, by breeding for that, you're going to end up with more of those alleles in the population than if you didn't do that, if you didn't use that artificial selection. Remember, in natural selection, it's not about the breeder doing it, it's about the environment doing it, right? The environmental conditions are going to be the one that is selecting for which alleles are going to be most beneficial in that environment, right? Remember, it all comes back to the genetics. The organisms had to have variation in the population, and if the environment changed, if the organism has a phenotype that allows for it to survive and reproduce, it will pass its genes on, and we will see a shift in the population allele frequencies because of that. And it's all based on environmental conditions. Okay? Individuals that have those favorable phenotypes based on the environment that they're in will survive and reproduce at greater rates. They increase their fitness, and they therefore will see those alleles in greater numbers in future generations. Selection we spent a lot of time with. What were you going to say, Evan?
I was going to ask, doesn't mutation drive selection?
Mutation is necessary for us to have different alleles in the population so that natural selection can act, right?
Okay.
If there was, everybody was the same, then there would be no natural selection, right? If there was no difference in genetic material due to mutation, then there would be no natural selection.
So couldn't you just say that, so what you said before about how natural selection was the only evolutionary change that provides
Adaptive,
change,
yeah, adaptive evolution.
Produces adaptive change, isn't that kind of technically false because you still need mutation in order to have natural selection?
What it means is that mutations are going to be random, and they are not going to result in adaptive evolution. Most of the time, in fact, they don't help anything out at all. They're usually negative, right? We can say that, yeah, there was a mutation and it ended up being beneficial. I would not say as a whole that this is resulting in adaptive evolution. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I'm a great shooter. I can go to the Olympics because I closed my eyes and hit the bullseye one time, right? Oh, so now because I hit the bullseye one time, I'm an expert marksman, right? That's what you're saying, is that because a mutation happened that was beneficial, that ended up being beneficial, now mutations are a cause of this, but that is few and far between. So that's why it's not considered as being a component of adaptive evolution, whereas natural selection is always that way, 100%.
Well, what I'm trying to say.
But you're right, mutations do contribute to natural selection. So we can take it back and say, yeah, well, if that mutation came about and then it was adaptive evolution afterwards, so now mutation, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, because since it leads to natural selection, I was going to say A than B.
Yes, but just know that mutations is not considered to be a mechanism by which adaptive evolution generally takes place. Yes, we can trace it back and we can follow it back and come to that conclusion. But if you're reading textbooks or answering questions on exams, as to not confuse everybody, that it won't be a mechanism of great adaptive evolution.
Okay.
All right. Write this down, it's important. 3 conditions for natural selection to occur. First of all, there has to be variation. What does variation mean?
Differences.
Variety in the genes. Variety, genetic variety. There has to be genetic variety. That's what they're talking about here. There's variety. Usually when we look at variety, We don't know about it on the genetic perspective. How do we know if there's variety in a population usually? The phenotype. We look at appearances, right? We look at the way an organism looks, and we know if there's genetic variation. But we know that for natural selection to take place, it can't just be some variety, right? For instance, we can't look at people and say, wow, look, that person has been lifting and they're super swollen, now this person's skinny, they never lift, and compare those things if they're not directly related to a genetic component. So there has to be variation, but that variation has to be genetically inheritable. It has to be able to be passed down from generation to generation. That's huge. If the variation of the population is not heritable, if it's not able to be passed down from generation to generation, then natural selection will not take place. And whatever this variation is, there can be tons of variation that gets passed out from generation to generation. But if it does not affect an individual's ability or a population's ability to survive and reproduce, pass their genes on to the next generation, then it doesn't matter. That factor that doesn't allow them to be able to find a mate and be able to survive and reproduce, then that factor is not an influencer in natural selection. So it says differences in number of offspring. That means because you have certain genes, you can make more babies. So the genes have to be associated with making more babies, right? If you have a different gene and it's heritable, but it doesn't make you better at passing your genes on to the next generation, then it doesn't influence natural selection. Those are huge. That's important. All right, so now take a moment to